Okay, so now to focus more specifically on, not that water isn't important for life, because I just made the case for why it is, but to focus specifically on the molecules of life, molecules that are found in living things. Okay. I don't know if you've heard me say this phrase before, but it's something that biologists in particular are really fond of saying, is the phrase form follows function, right? Because we like alliteration. No, the reason that this is a kind of a popular phrase is that um, fundamentally in biology and in other sciences as well, the way that something functions is determined by its structure and vice versa, right? So just as an example, not all of the cells in your body look the same. Different cells look totally different, have totally different structures depending on what their job is, right? And so when we talk about cells, we'll talk a bit about that. So this idea that you have to have a diversity of form if you're going to have a diversity of function, okay? So some examples, this is too many examples, but whatever, okay? The way that your sense of taste works, right? The fundamental basis of your sense of taste is you don't literally have holes in your tongue that look like this. Excuse me. Are you listening? You can listen if you want. Okay, so you don't literally have holes in your tongue, but you do have receptors on your taste buds, and those receptors that you use to taste things like sour, bitter, salty, savory, sweet, the way that they work is by the shapes of certain molecules fitting into them, like a lock and key, right? So the reason that it's like you go, oh, that tastes salty, is because of the shape of the salty compounds, okay? So form determines function, okay? This is true in a class of chemical called pheromones.
Can you stop the video?
Okay, I gotta pause because he needs something. So my youngster just asked a very good question. He said, "But mom, this looks like little circles. That doesn't fit in there. What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, bud, the individual circles are the actual atoms, but a crystal of salt, right, is shaped like a cube, right? It's shaped like a square, and that's why that shape's like that." So he asked a very astute question. Good job, 8-year-old. All right, now go back to watching your show. Anyway, go back to your sea cucumber butts or whatever you're watching. Future biologist, not really. He's going to go into computer science or something probably because he's more into. He wants to design video games. Anyway, are you still watching? You can keep watching if you want to. Anyway, okay. So what I was about to say is that there is a class of chemical called pheromones, and pheromones are communication chemicals. These work essentially the same way, right? So pheromones come in different shapes, and there's so much variety in the shapes because there's all kinds, hundreds of thousands probably of different types of pheromones, and they're all very, very specific for different organisms. So some organisms, some animals, the way that they communicate is by releasing these communication chemicals called pheromones into the air. So in this little example, we're looking at a female gypsy moth, and she produces a pheromone that is detected by male gypsy moths. And they can detect super small quantities of these chemicals in the air with their antennae, right? So see his little, they look like feathers on the front of his head. Moths often have antennae that kind of look like feathers to have a lot of surface area because he's got all these little receptors that are exactly the right size and shape, right, for those to dock in those little receptors so that he can figure out not just that there's a female nearby, but how far away she is, right? What direction, the whole nine, okay? So, right, that's all shape. Neurotransmitters are another thing that are shaped. So in your nervous system, in your neurons, your brain cells, the way that they communicate with each other is with chemicals that have a distinct shape, and the receptors fit those chemicals. Yes, darling.
So you stopped the video?
All right, so we have established the importance of a molecule's shape, right? Cool. So how do we end up with a diversity of shapes in molecules? This is where carbon becomes important. So as you may recall, carbon had what was the atomic number of carbon? I believe it was 6 was the atomic number, right? So you have 6 protons in the middle, and then you have 2 electrons in the first shell. And then you have 1, 2, 3, 4 in the second shell, right? So you have these 4 empty spaces. And remember, if you have more than 1 or 2 spaces, what kind of bonds, hold on a minute, bud. What kind of bonds do you form? Are they going to be ionic or covalent? It's too many for ionic, right? So it's going to be a covalent bond. Specifically, carbon can form 1, 2, 3, 4 covalent bonds. The cool thing about that is that because carbon can form 4 covalent bonds, carbon is extremely useful to make skeletons for molecules, to make not only that vary in length, right, which is what we're looking at up here, but chains of carbon can be straight or they can be branched. You can have double bonds, because if you can make 4 bonds, that means a double bond and 2 single bonds, or it means 4 separate single bonds, or it means 2 double bonds, right? Yeah. Carbon also forms rings, okay? So it is extremely flexible in its structure, which is why it's so important. Yes, honey.
So I was gonna ask, these they're not covalent bonds. So why are they?
So what I was showing my students, honey, is that because it has these open spaces, it's able to form covalent bonds. They already heard that part of my lecture. You didn't yet, but I can show it to you if you want.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
One more thing though.
Okay.
Can you go back?
To what?
The other page.
To this?
That one.
Uh-huh.
So hold on. One more thing.
How about you ask me later? I'm going to keep going and you can ask me later. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. All right. So carbon can form these incredibly varied molecules, varied in their size, right? They can be incredibly long, but also varied in their shape. Okay, so tons of variation. It almost reminds me of like Legos or something, right? You can make anything out of Legos. You can make anything out of carbon, right? So it's kind of different, but the same general idea, yeah? So typically large molecules that are made up of mostly carbon and hydrogen, we call them, it's gonna be a big surprise, hydrocarbons. And so hydrocarbons, right, these big molecules are the molecules that act as the building blocks for life, okay? Here's a little side by side between gasoline and this is fat over here, right? Because we're looking at, some delicious ribs and french fries. So fat and then gasoline. Yes, honey bunny.
But I thought hydro stands for
Water.
Liquid.
No, hydro means hydrogen in this case.
Oh.
I know, but people often use hydro to refer to water, but that's because water has 2 hydrogens and an oxygen.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, so hydrocarbons are the types of molecules that we're talking about. We also sometimes refer to these as I can spell macro. Let's try that again. Macromolecules. Macro, is the opposite of micro, so it means
giant.
Big. Got like my TA back here. My TA is doing a really good job today. So macromolecules means big molecules, yeah? Because they usually are. All right. Macromolecules come in smaller units and larger units, okay? So let's define a couple terms really quickly. So I'm going to add a little screen here. monomer, polymer. Okay, so the root mer means unit. Okay, and mono means, yes, Dakin.
I think it means like maybe commutative.
No, mono means one.
Yeah,
Poly means,
like multiple or many.
yeah, okay, so a monomer, literally that means one unit, so a single unit.
Yeah.
And a polymer means, oh, I can't spell. Let's try that again. I'm feeling anxious because I'm being watched.
And
Many units.
don't mistake those for plural and singular. That is pretty important.
Right? So a single unit of something, of one of these macromolecules, we call a monomer. Mer means unit. And a polymer is many units. Okay, so that in mind, one of the things we need to talk about before we talk about our four main classes of macromolecules, right? So we're going to talk about four classes of macromolecules. Before we talk about that, we are going to talk about the processes that are involved in building and breaking apart polymers. Yes, my darling.
What does processes mean?
More than one process.
Oh.
Okay, so here's a little diagram that shows two different processes. Okay, so for now, oh wait, hold on. For now, we're just going to ignore this. Don't look at this. Okay, we're not going to look at that, right? So what you have on the top is you have a polymer, right? And so it's basically what you're looking at is you're looking at these little blue circles, and each blue circle represents an individual monomer. And so all together, right, they make a polymer. My TA didn't like my annotation over here, so he made me change it, and I'm changing it back to the way that I want it because I'm in charge. Anyway, okay, so you have this large polymer, okay, many units all connected. When you add water to that, and other things, enzymes to make it happen, we'll talk about what an enzyme is in a couple minutes, a reaction that breaks it apart is called hydrolysis. Let's break apart that word, hydrolysis. So in this case, hydro is meaning water, like my little associate said earlier, right? So the hydro, you should be thinking water, okay? Lysis means to break, okay? So what happens in a hydrolysis reaction is you are adding water to a polymer and you're breaking the polymer apart. So you are breaking a bond right? And breaking off a polymer. Okay, I should say it this way, breaking one monomer off of the polymer. Okay, so that's hydrolysis. That's what's happening in that direction, top to bottom. Okay, why do we care about hydrolysis? A variety of reasons, but just one example is this is what you do with your food that you eat, right? So the way that you, yeah, in a minute, bub. The way that you are able to digest your food, so first you chew it and you get it into small bits, but then you have all these different chemicals in your body that break down these large molecules into individual smaller parts, and that's what you actually absorb from your food, okay? So that process is called hydrolysis, all right? Now, let's erase all of this. Okay, and let's look at the opposite. So now we're going to ignore hydrolysis and we're going to look at this other arrow. Okay, and so this other arrow is showing something called dehydration synthesis. I'll be with you shortly. Dehydration synthesis. So what does dehydration mean? right? When you don't have enough water or you remove water, you're dehydrated, okay? And synthesis is a fancy word for to build or to make something, yeah? Okay, so dehydration synthesis is the name of the process of building a larger polymer by removing water. So do you see this hydrogen over here and the hydrogen and the oxygen over here, right? So dehydration synthesis is taking those away, and these form a bond right there. And now what was 5 monomers and a polymer made of 5 monomers and then a separate monomer becomes 6 monomers in this longer polymer. And there's the water that you removed. Okay, so the reason we're looking at both of these in the same same diagram, is that fundamentally hydrolysis and dehydration synthesis are just opposite reactions. It's the same, right? It's the same products and reactants, just which one we call the product and which one we call the reactant vary depending on which way it's going. What's the significant? So I already told you why you care about hydrolysis. Why do you care about dehydration synthesis? This is how you build large molecules. This is how you build polymers. This is how you make proteins in your body. Okay? All right. Okay, so those are the reactions, right? Those are the 2 reactions. So now we're going to move into discussing actually, no, we're not. We're going to look at this picture. Then we're going to go into discussing the 4 different classes of macromolecules. So this is what I just described, this idea that the processes of hydrolysis and dehydration synthesis happen in cells all the time, right? And so here what is she eating? Is that supposed to be a granola bar? I don't know, right? She's eating something. She's chewing it up. It's going into her digestive system. And then a hydrolysis reaction is occurring to break up the protein, which is a large polymer, into individual monomers. And then later, those enter her bloodstream. And then later, you're knocking stuff off my bed, punk. Later, those monomers, amino acids that are floating around in her blood, are put together by dehydration synthesis, right? To make proteins, right? A polymer, okay? All right.
Can we go back for a second?
Okay, so that's why we care about these things. All right, so what process is happening here? This is shown a little bit differently, right? So, okay, the reaction is going this way. So product is what you make. Reactants are what you're starting off with, okay? So what process is this? What process is happening? Is it hydrolysis or is it dehydration synthesis? And how do you know? What are we doing? So we're forming a little bond between this and this, and we're doing that by removing water. And we're taking 2 separate, here's one monomer, here's another monomer, and we're turning them into a polymer. So this is, ding, 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 dehydration synthesis. Good job. Okay, cool. All right, so like I said, there are 4 classes of macromolecules that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And so carbohydrates are our first one. What just happened? Ugh. I don't know what just happened. Let's try this again. I'm just going to keep going. I don't know what happened. Um, share screen. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going. We'll see what happens. Okay, so carbohydrates, right? Or carbs, if you prefer. Carbohydrates are a class of macromolecules that are primarily useful for energy, and also they are structural. And we'll look at some examples of those. The monomer of carbohydrates, we'll come back to that in a second, are called monosaccharides. Saccharide means sugar. So monosaccharide literally means single sugar. Okay? The polymer of carbohydrates is probably called what? That's right, a polysaccharide. We'll come back to these in a second, okay? So let's look at this little thing real quick. All right, so here we have a monosaccharide called glucose. And we have another one, another monosaccharide called fructose. If you look at those really carefully, they are different structures. They have the same number of carbons and hydrogens and oxygens, though, which is kind of interesting. Okay, we call those isomer. You don't need to know that term, though. I don't even care if you know that. Okay, right. So we have two monosaccharides, and our two monosaccharides, if we look at our arrow, are getting joined together to form sucrose, right? So C6H12O6, C6H12O6. They're being linked together, okay? And what do you get out of this? Get something called sucrose. C12, right? 6 plus 6, okay. 12 plus 12, 24. That's kind of weird. 6 plus 6 is 12. Why is it 11? Because two of the hydrogens and one of the oxygens become water. Okay, so we are building something, and in the process, we're removing water. So this is dehydration synthesis. With carbohydrates, we don't call these polysaccharides when there's only two units together. We call them disaccharides, because di means two. It's not a disaccharides, it's one disaccharide. Okay. Woo! Okay, dehydration synthesis, right? So glucose plus fructose gives us sucrose and a molecule of water. Sweet. Sucrose is table sugar, by the way, right? The sugar that you put in your coffee, yeah, is sucrose. Okay. All right. So there are a handful of different monosaccharides. Glucose and fructose are two of them. Okay, but there's others as well. Mostly monosaccharides are useful for energy. Okay, so glucose is used for energy, right? It's like quick energy that you can burn real fast. Okay, right? If you do not use all of the energy that you consume in the form of monosaccharides or even disaccharides, which you immediately break down to form monosaccharides, you can store it for later. All right. And if you don't use it within 24 hours or so, then you put it into long-term storage. Okay. So, right, the monosaccharide that's most common in your blood, glucose, right, is useful for energy. But if you don't use it, if you don't use all of it, everything that you consume, okay, then short term, those individual monomers, the monosaccharides, link up together to make a polysaccharide. And if you don't use that within 24 hours, then it gets put into long-term storage. And that's fat. Talk more about fat later. Fat is not a carbohydrate, as I'm sure you're aware. Okay. So some common disaccharides, like I said, sucrose is a disaccharide. Maltose is a delicious disaccharide that's in Whoppers. Okay. Lactose is found in milk, and that is also a disaccharide. Who knew? That's fascinating. That might be useful later. Just saying. I don't know. Okay. So disaccharides are double sugars, right? Two monomers, two monosaccharides together make disaccharides. Okay. All right. Polysaccharides. So there's a diversity of different types of polysaccharides. I'm giving you 4 examples just because I want you to see a little bit of the diversity in these. You don't need to be able to like draw these pictures or anything. Okay. So some that you may be familiar with. Okay. These are 2 examples of polysaccharides that are found in plants. One of them is starch. You know what starch is, right? Starch is found in a lot of food, right? So it's found in rice and wheat products and taters, right? And corn has a lot of starch in it too, right? And so essentially what starch is really, really, really long chains of glucose. Remember, glucose is a monomer, a monosaccharide. So really long chains of glucose all, stuck together make starch. Okay. When you consume starch, you digest it super rapidly back into glucose, right? Using what process? What process would break up our polysaccharide into a monosaccharide? That's right, hydrolysis. Good. Okay. Right. So the reason you like to eat taters is because there's a lot of energy in them, right? Because there's a lot of glucose all stuck together. Okay. Another polysaccharide found in plants. So this is energy use, right? So the plant is storing energy and then animals are stealing the energy from the plant by eating it. Okay. Another polysaccharide that's found in plants is called cellulose. Cellulose is different from starch because it is structural. So now instead of just chains of glucose, you have these cable-like fibers of glucose that are like linked together and like twisted, and it kind of makes like a rope almost. You can't break these down. We don't have the enzymes necessary to break this down. So cellulose, any cellulose that's in your diet, we call it something else. We call it fiber. Oh, wait. What's fiber? I can't remember where I first heard this, but I find it charming. Some people call fiber nature's scrub brush because it keeps your digestive tract clean. Because cellulose, you cannot digest. So it goes through your digestive tract without being broken down. And I know what you're thinking about right now. You're thinking about corn, and that's fair. Okay. So there are certain plant materials that you like. This is why you can't eat wood, by the way. Wood has a tremendous amount of energy in it. We know this because if you light it on fire, it burns, right? It has a ton of energy. But we can't break down cellulose. Animals can't break down cellulose. So wood is not a good food source for us. Okay. Too much cellulose. We can't break it down. Okay. So those are 2 examples of plant polysaccharides, right? So starch is quick energy. Cellulose is useful in your diet as fiber, but not so much a source of energy. And for that matter, the plant isn't using it as a source of energy either. The plant is using it as a structural component. So it helps to build their cell walls. Okay. Animals contain polysaccharides too, right? So the reason they're showing this lovely young lady running here is that probably what she's doing while she's going on her jog is she is burning, she is using up, she is breaking down a polysaccharide that's found in animal tissue, right, in our tissue, specifically in your liver and in your muscles, called glycogen. Glycogen is very similar to starch in the sense that it is long chains of glucose, but it's a little bit more branched. So instead of being twisted up like cellulose, it's branched. Okay. Glycogen, by the by, is the stuff that you store sugar as, okay? So let me tell you a story. You wake up in the morning feeling a little hungry, so you go get a bowl of Captain Crunch. Captain Crunch is my favorite sugary cereal, and it is by far the best, and I will not hear any other opinion about best sugary cereal. It is for sure any of the flavors of Captain Crunch. I haven't had it in years, probably, I don't know, probably at least a couple of years. Anyway, but it's delicious. Okay, so you digest that, you get a like truckload of sugar into your bloodstream. Yeah, unless you're going running right after eating that Captain Crunch, you're not going to use all that sugar right away, right? So your body starts to store it for short-term storage as glycogen, right? So you stash all that glucose that you don't need right away as glycogen, and then, later on, you get up and you go for a run, and then you break up that glycogen to be able to use the glucose. Yeah? Short-term energy storage. Okay. Chitin is a very cool polysaccharide that's found in some animals, not us, right? Mostly in arthropods, like insect spiders. Also, it's found in fungi. It's kind of cool. It's found in, so it makes up the exoskeleton of insects and spiders. It also makes up the exoskeleton in crustaceans, so like shrimp, crabs, lobsters, those guys. Okay. It's very similar to cellulose, except that it's got little nitrogens in it. It also is not digestible because it's structural, right? So I hope you're seeing a theme here. Each one of these has something that's used for energy storage, short-term energy storage, and something that's used for structure, okay? So that's carbohydrates, right? So here's, just another sort of graphic that kind of talks about, well, how do you make a polysaccharide? Whatever, okay? All right. Um, if polysaccharides are essentially just longer chains of individual monosaccharides, right? Does it make a difference whether or not you consume a bunch of simple sugar or something that is considered a complex carbohydrate? Let's talk about that for a sec, okay? So the two examples they're giving you here is they're showing you oatmeal and they're showing you orange juice or an orange, okay? Oranges have a ton of, albeit natural, unprocessed sugar, but they still have a ton of sugar in them because it's fruit. Fruit has sugar in it, right? And so when you drink a glass of orange juice, you get a bunch of sugar all at once, right? Your blood sugar goes up and then it goes down, okay? You store that sugar away for later, okay? Whereas, same thing that happens with Captain Crunch, but Captain Crunch is better tasting than orange juice, right? What happens if you eat oatmeal? What happens if you eat a complex carb? Well, the nice thing here is that even though it may have the same amount of sugar in it, because it also has a bunch of fiber in it, right? The fiber sort of slows down your digestion. So you don't get this blood sugar spike, right? Your blood sugar goes up slowly and then it kind of levels off and slowly goes down, right? So, this is the thing that you see with your kids with Halloween, right? They eat too much candy and they get all like, and then they turn into like little monsters because their blood sugar dropped, right? If you get cranky in the morning, like mid-morning after, your Captain Crunch has all been digested and, you're feeling cranky, maybe you should have gone with a more complex carbohydrate. I'm just saying. And this is why I don't have Captain Crunch anymore, because now I'm a grown-up who eats oatmeal. Being a grown-up sucks. My TA is back. He might have some things to add. We'll see. Okay. So that's carbohydrates. All right. Anyway, talked about fiber. Okay, so that was our first class of macromolecules. Our second class of macromolecules are the lipids. Lipids, there's like 3 different types of lipids that all have different functions. So I don't even want to say like an overall function, but I will say this. The defining feature of lipids is that all lipids are, as they say, hydrophobic. Let's think about that word hydrophobic. So hydro means what? It means water. Phobia, phobic, what does that mean? So hydrophobic like literally translates to, yes, honey.
I think it means like scared of water.
Scared of water. Good job. Okay, now you and I both know that molecules are not afraid of things because molecules don't have emotions. Okay, so that's the literal translation of the word hydrophobic. But what it really means is that we consider a molecule to be a hydrophobic molecule if it does not mix well with water. So I hope that you are immediately thinking of an example of trying to mix water and oil, right? So if you put water and oil in a jar and you shake, 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 they're going to like mix with each other for like half a second and immediately start to separate, right? And that's because lipids are large molecules that are non-polar. So what does that mean, non-polar? So, right? So oil is a lipid and it doesn't mix well with water. Okay. Because remember, water mixes well with other things that are polar and also ions and things like that. Water does not mix well with lipids. So, like I said, that's like the defining feature of what it means to be a lipid is that it is hydrophobic. As it turns out, the different types of lipids that we're going to look at actually are quite different in their structure. So they don't have the structure is not the common feature with lipids. The common feature with lipids is their the fact that they're nonpolar, the fact that they're hydrophobic. Okay. All right. So there's two examples of lipids in this picture. One of them is something called a phospholipid. Phospholipids, we're going to talk more about when we talk about cells, and specifically when we talk about cell membranes. Phospholipid, oh, that was rude. That snuck up on me. Phospholipids have these tails that are very hydrophobic, right? Long tails, so they don't mix well with water. Okay, and then they have a phosphate group on the top. Like I said, we'll talk more about these later. They're really important cell membranes. We'll get to them. Okay, so that's one type of lipid. Another type of lipid, a phospholipid, is one type of lipid. Okay, another type of lipid are sterols. Specifically, this example is cholesterol is a sterol. Notice the structure of these two things, of this and this, are totally different, right? The only reason they're in the same category of macromolecules is because both of them are non-polar. That's the only reason, because their structure is quite different. Sterols, like cholesterol, have all kinds of different functions in the body. They're actually also found in cell membranes, which we'll talk about when we get to cells. They function as, we'll come back to triglycerides in a second. They function as, sorry, I'm just kind of skipping ahead of myself, as hormones, right? So not all of your hormones, but many of your hormones are sterol based. So for example, certain types of estrogen and testosterone, right? Those are all steroids. Oh, he's trying to teach my class, dude. He's trying to take over my job. Okay, so sterols. Okay, so that was our second type of lipid. The third and final main category of lipid are triglycerides. So let's go back a little bit. They're called triglycerides because they have a glycerol portion, and then they have 3 fatty acid chains, right? So, yeah, so triglycerides include fats and oils and waxes, right? Those are all examples of triglycerides, okay? And that's our third class of lipid, our third type of lipid, okay? Right? So triglycerides can be saturated or unsaturated. So let's talk about that for a minute. So I'm sure you've heard these terms, primarily used when people are talking about like, dietary considerations. Yeah. So a saturated fat, what that means is that, I mean, that's it, right? That's the nugget. Saturated fats have the maximum number of hydrogen atoms in their tail. So they're all single bonds. They're very, very straight. The tails are very, very straight. And as a result of that, they're typically solid at room temperature. They're found in higher concentrations in animal products, and they're less healthy for you. Okay. So they're showing you here butter, cheese, steak, right? These things all have a large portion of saturated fat in them. He sent in his little toady. He sent in his sister to yell at me. And he's back. Okay. So those are saturated fats. Okay. Um, Unsaturated fats, on the other hand, because there are double bonds formed in various places on those fatty acid tails, the tails tend to be kinky, right? They're bent in various different places, which means that they are typically liquid at room temperature. Okay, hold on, bud. Let me finish. Okay. Um, so unsaturated fats are typical in plants. So saturated fats are more common in animal sources like meat and dairy products. Okay. Unsaturated fats are more common in plants. There are exceptions to this, though. Certain fats found in fish are unsaturated. And for that matter, some plants have saturated fat. So palm oil, coconut oil, all of the tropical oils are saturated. And that's why coconut oil is a solid at fairly cool room temperature. It melts real easily, right? In my kitchen, because we don't have air conditioning, it's liquid all the time. but it will solidify if it's cool enough, because coconut oil is heavily saturated fat. Okay, so more often found in plant sources. Okay, generally considered healthier. Okay. Trans fat is an interesting thing. Trans fat, oh God, okay, he wanted to say something. I'm going to finish talking about trans fats, then you can come back, okay? So trans fats are actually much more highly regulated than they used to be. So they used to be super duper common because um, there was this interesting cultural shift, okay? So back in the battle days, back when I was a kid, right? Um, people people didn't distinguish between different types of fat, at least from a like diet conscious, health conscious perspective. It was like all fat is bad, right? And then people started doing some research and they found out that saturated fat, turns out it increases your risk of heart disease and all kinds of negative things, right? So heart disease is scary. And so people are like, yeah, okay, we don't want to have any saturated fat. So many food producers, whether we're talking about restaurants or talking about making prepackaged food, pre-prepared food, all that kind of stuff, switched from saturated fat that they had been using to various different types of vegetable fat. Okay. So back when I was a kid, McDonald's fried their French fries in beef fat. Apparently they were delicious. I don't know. I was a baby, so I didn't eat French fries. Right? But they used to fry their fries in like beef tallow, right? And apparently it was phenomenal. Okay. Well, as soon as all the saturated fat, you know, fear, justified fear, right, came to be, they were like, oh, okay, we got to switch to unsaturated fat, right? So they switched to vegetable fats. Well, there are some challenges with oils, right? With various different vegetable oils. And that is one, it's harder to process, it's harder to move around liquids than it is to move around solids, right? So it's a lot easier to transport a brick of fat than it is a jug of fat, Okay, so just transportation is a bigger pain in the butt when you're dealing with unsaturated fats. Another thing is that saturated fats tend to have a longer shelf life after when they're prepared, right? Whereas unsaturated fats tend to spoil more quickly, right? So this is especially useful if you're making food that you want to sit on the shelf for a long time. So I'm looking at you, Entenmann's, with your donuts and your pastries and stuff, right? So they historically used saturated fat like lard or, you know, other things like that, butter, right? Because it would keep on the shelf longer than it would if they made it with vegetable oil, okay? Because it didn't go rancid as fast, right? So saturated fats had a longer shelf life, okay? So, but now that the public is afraid of saturated fats, they got to do something, right? So what they do is they switch to saturated fats, but they tinker around with the chemistry of saturated fats a little bit to make them essentially a copy of a saturated fat. And we call those trans fats. So trans fats, essentially what they are is they are unsaturated fats that have been converted into saturated fats. Okay, and they do that by a process called hydrogenation. You're adding hydrogen to them to essentially, right, make them with the straight tails, right? So remember, unsaturated means kinky tails, saturated means straight tails, okay? So trans fats. So they would say on their labels, right? McDonald's French fries in the, you know, late 80s, early 90s, 100% vegetable oil, and everybody's thinking, great, this is perfect for my health. It's not saturated fat anymore. It's no more beef tallow. So it's fine, right? It's vegetable oil. It's fine. It's healthy. It's good, right? Well, except for the fact that it was all trans fat, right? It was still a solid, okay? It turns out later on we discover that trans fat is actually even worse than saturated fat. So you're better off eating lard or butter or saturated fat than you are eating vegetable oils that have been hydrogenated. So trans fat, it turns out, worse for your health. So much so that a few years ago, I want to say it was like 3 or 4 years ago, the state of California essentially banned trans fats, not a complete ban, but they dramatically changed the labels on foods, and they essentially limited, like heavily limited, the amount of trans fat that you can put in food because it's so dangerous, right? The state of California has designated trans fat as like a toxin that is not fit for human consumption because it's so much worse for you than saturated fat is, right? So if you did the grocery store project, and it was this semester, I didn't really update the assignment, and I had you look for some trans fats in products. So they essentially got rid of trans fats in most products, right? And you guys found that, right? And so now we've gone right back to where we started, right? Where either now the choice is you have to use unsaturated fats and deal with all the drama of liquid and it goes rancid faster and it's a pain in the butt, or back to using saturated fats. And this is part of the reason why coconut oil has become so incredibly popular, because it's a saturated fat. So it has all of the convenient aspects of saturated fat, but it doesn't have the bad reputation of animal fat, but it's still a saturated fat. Okay. Um, so anyway, okay, so that's trans fat. So trans fat is basically on its way out. It's really hard to find now. It used to be super common in any kind of prepared food, like crackers and cookies and pastries, and all of that stuff was just like crammed full of trans fat all the time. And now it's super hard to find. You can only find it in like margarine and like a couple of other things. So anyway, it's kind of interesting, right? How things have changed in a short period of time. Okay, so trans fat is the devil. Saturated fat is bad for your health. Trans fat is like crazy bad for your health. So bad that we don't even have it anymore. Okay. All right. Oh, I forgot to talk about anabolic steroids. Dang. I already talked about phospholipids. Okay. I'm not going to go back and talk about it. You can read about anabolic steroids if you want. Here's A-Rod. I do know baseball better than football. Here's A-Rod. He got busted for doping. Anabolic steroids are sterols that there are legitimate uses for these for people who, don't make the proper number of, the proper amount of testosterone, right? But people also use them illegally, right? Inappropriately, to put on extra muscle mass and, all that kind of stuff. So when people get busted for steroid use, it's anabolic steroids, which essentially are mimics of testosterone, right? That causes all kinds of problems for your health. So if you're interested in learning more about anabolic steroids, yeah, do a little bit of research on that, because steroids do all kinds of nasty things to you if you abuse them, if you take too many of them. The main thing, the way that anabolic steroids affect men in particular, is because you are now supplementing with extra testosterone effectively, at least that's how your body responds to it, your testes shrink, because now they're like, we don't need to make as much testosterone. We have all this testosterone that we're getting, from an outside source. So your testes shrink, and your skin, you get breakouts, and you get angry, because one of the effects of testosterone is it increases aggression. Okay, so people call it roid rage. Yeah. So, and like super bad acne and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, for the ladies who take anabolic steroids, it tends to produce other unpleasant side effects like growing more hair and deeper voice and manly things. Okay, because normally our bodies don't make that much testosterone. Small quantities, but not that much. Okay. Anyway, and then like I said, we already talked about phospholipids. So those are the lipids, right? So the three different kinds of lipids are phospholipids, sterols, and triglycerides. Okay. Know a little bit about the different kinds of fats. Okay. And we'll stop here, and we'll do the next video will be proteins and nucleic acids.